They laughed when she walked into the engine room. A rusted Cold War submarine, its heart frozen in silence, and one girl mechanic with a ponytail, bruised knuckles, and something in her eyes they couldn't quite name. 7 officers stood back and smirked, already betting she wouldn't last an hour. But what none of them knew was that this wasn't just an engine to her. It was the last conversation she never got to finish with her father. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you. If you believe in second chances, in legacy, in the quiet strength of people who never stop trying, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more powerful than this one. The clanging echo of boots on steel grated down the length of the old submarine as 7 officers filed into the engine room. Arms crossed, expressions somewhere between amused and unimpressed. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly green haze across the rusted bulk of the Cold War-era diesel engine that hadn't run in over 2 decades. The air was thick with old oil, mildew, and something quieter doubt. That doubt crystallized in the smirk of Lieutenant Harrow, the tallest of them all, who turned to the others with a lazy grin and said loud enough for her to hear, "10 grand says she can't even get the manifold cover off." Callie Rhodes stood alone beside the machine, one hand resting lightly on the oxidized housing, the other tightening her ponytail. She didn't react to the laughter, didn't flinch. Just let her fingers glide over the metal like she was listening to it breathe. Her navy blue jumpsuit was already stained at the knees, and her black boots were scuffed to hell. This wasn't a demonstration. This wasn't even about the money. It was personal. She looked up at the rows of pipes and valves, as if seeing a familiar skyline. Most people saw a fossil. She saw an unfinished sentence. The same model her father had worked on back when he was stationed on the USS Thresher's sister ship before the accident that took his life, and left her with nothing but a folded flag, a locked toolbox, and too many unspoken words. "You gonna start or just stare at it all day?" another officer called out, trying to get a laugh. A few chuckled. One didn't. Lieutenant Marks, younger, quieter, shifted his weight but said nothing. Callie glanced at him briefly, then turned back to the engine. Without a word, she unzipped her top pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook, spiral-bound, oil-stained, and held together with black tape. Inside were hand-sketched diagrams, troubleshooting notes, even a few pages written in a child's handwriting. It had been hers once, then her father's, now hers again. She opened to the page labeled Submarine Type 2 Primary Reanimation Protocol, and began unscrewing the first rusted bolts with a methodical grace that made even the smug ones fall silent for a beat. Each movement was purposeful, deliberate. Her wrench didn't slip, her hands didn't shake. "Should we stop her before she breaks something?" Harrow muttered. "She's not guessing," Marks replied quietly. "She knows what she's doing." Callie removed the manifold cover with a satisfying crack, revealing a mess of corrosion and tangled decay beneath. It should have been discouraging. Instead, she smiled the smallest, briefest flicker of a smile like she had just opened a time capsule meant only for her. Then she reached back, pulled her hair tighter, and said the only words she'd speak all day, "Don't blink. You'll miss it." And with that, the engine room, for the first time in 20 years, came alive with the sound of purpose. By morning, the smirks had faded into silent curiosity. The officers still came by in shifts, pretending to inspect reports or log notes, but their eyes always drifted to the girl hunched over the submarine's open engine. Callie had stripped half the outer shell already, the rusted panels stacked neatly to the side, each bolt and gasket labeled and laid out like a surgeon's tray. The massive diesel block loomed in the center, like some dormant creature, its heart long stilled but never forgotten. She moved around it the way a dancer circles a partner, knowing where to lean, when to hold back, how to listen. The overhead lights buzzed softly. The space was warmer now, less sterile. Grease marked her collarbone. A streak of black curved along her cheek like war paint. The others watched her work, but she barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, not on the men, not even on the bet, but on a memory carved in steel and fire. She was 10 years old when she first stood beside an engine like this. Her father had taken her into the workshop behind their house, a lean-to shack with sheet metal walls and a concrete floor cracked down the middle. The place smelled like gasoline and pine needles. He didn't talk much, but that day he knelt beside a half-rebuilt cylinder head, tapped it with a wrench, and said, "Engines are just puzzles. You listen close. They'll tell you where the pieces go." She had spent the next 15 years listening. Now, as she peered into the intake assembly, she saw what most mechanics would miss: microfractures near the mounting bracket, warping in the fuel line routing. The previous attempts at repair had been brute force. Welds over welds, hoses zip-tied in desperation. Callie shook her head slowly. Whoever had worked on this before didn't understand it. They tried to command it. You don't command machines like this. You collaborate. A sharp metallic pop echoed through the hull, one of the officers dropping a wrench from the catwalk above. She didn't even flinch. Just reached for a flashlight and leaned deeper into the belly of the beast. Her breath slow, steady. The air inside was warm, almost humid. She clicked the light on and whispered to herself, still breathing. By mid-afternoon, she'd reached the main control manifold. The gasket was shot, the bolts fused by time and salt air. She sat back on her heels and pulled off her gloves, flexing her fingers. One knuckle was bleeding. She wiped it on her pants and turned the page in her notebook. There, scrawled in the margins beside a hand-drawn diagram, were her father's words. "If the old girl won't talk, rewire the breath." She traced the note with her thumb. It had been his shorthand for rerouting air intake through the bypass valve, a risky trick. But sometimes the only way to wake something that had been asleep too long. Callie closed the notebook, looked back at the engine. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's see if you remember me too." Hi. By the fourth day, Callie's hands no longer looked human. Every crease was blackened with grease, every nail chipped or cracked. The palms blistered from torquing down bolts older than her, and her wrist ached from holding a flashlight in the crook of her neck too long. But she didn't slow. She never did. If anything, she moved faster now, not out of urgency, but instinct, like the engine had started whispering back. The supply depot at Port Gideon was 2 towns over, tucked behind a crumbling naval fence and guarded by a Vietnam vet who hadn't smiled since the Cold War. Callie walked in without hesitation, a list in one hand and a broken manifold in the other. The place smelled like rust and time. Rows of metal shelves stretched to the ceiling, each one a crypt of forgotten parts and forgotten stories. The man behind the counter didn't look up until she placed the manifold on the desk. "No one's asked for this part in 20 years, he muttered. "You rebuilding ghosts?" Callie looked him in the eye. "Just one." He squinted, head tilting slightly. "You got a name?" She hesitated. "Callie Rhodes." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy. He leaned back slowly, eyes scanning her face like he was looking through her. "You're Rhodes's girl," he finally said. "Chief Rhodes, USS Belgrave, yeah?" She nodded. That name hadn't been said out loud in years. Not in this town. Not in any town. The old man stood and disappeared into the back, without another word. Minutes passed. Then he returned with something wrapped in an old cloth, a dented red toolbox. The corners faded, the handle wrapped in black electrical tape. "Your old man left this here," he said, voice softer now. "Came in for a part once. Never picked this back up. Said he'd be back in a few days." Callie stared at it. Her breath caught in her throat. "I didn't open it," the man added. "Figured it'd find its way home." She reached out slowly, brushing the lid with her fingertips. There were scratches along the front, some from wear, but others etched deliberately. She recognized them. They were the same crude letters her father taught her to carve with a flathead when she was 6. RHODES. She opened it carefully. Inside, a set of sockets, still organized by size. A pair of gloves. A few old photos, stuck between the lining and the side panel. And tucked in the very bottom, a folded slip of yellowed paper. She unfolded it. Her hands were trembling now. "If you ever find this engine, finish it. You'll know how. Dad, no salutation. No goodbye. Just an instruction. A passing of the torch, as quiet and firm as the man himself. Callie closed the lid, slid the toolbox toward her, and nodded once. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She just turned, toolbox in hand, and walked back into the shadows of steel and memory, back toward the beast that was waiting to be revived. The next night, Callie didn't leave the sub. The world outside kept spinning. Cars moved along the coast. Kids played ball in the lots behind the Naval Museum. And somewhere across town, an old song drifted from a diner jukebox. But inside the steel belly of the submarine, everything was still, just the steady hum of a work light and the sound of Callie's breath as she crouched beneath the auxiliary intake valve, splicing together decades-old wiring like she'd done it 1,000 times in dreams. Her ribs ached from leaning too long into the same position. A bruise the size of a fist bloomed across her side from where a misjudged pulley swing caught her the night before. But she kept moving. Grease in her hair, sweat in her eyes, the same jumpsuit now permanently stained across the thighs. She worked like someone on the edge of sleep body, locked in muscle memory, mind somewhere between past and present. Above her, a single officer watched quietly from the catwalk. Lieutenant Marks again. He didn't make a sound, didn't interrupt, just leaned over the railing, arms crossed, watching the girl everyone else had underestimated take an impossible engine apart with more grace than most of them had ever seen. At some point, the lights flickered. Callie paused, looked up. The fuse box on the aft wall sparked, then snapped, then died. A third of the engine room went dark. She didn't curse, didn't flinch. She grabbed a flashlight with one hand and a soldering iron with the other, wedged both between her knees, and began rewiring blind. The beam from her flashlight bounced wildly, casting shadows across the exposed valves and wiring clusters like veins on a beating heart. "Do you want help?" Marks called down eventually. She paused, glanced up through sweat-streaked lashes, and shook her head. "No offense, Lieutenant," she said, "but this engine doesn't trust just anyone." He smiled faintly. Fair enough. It took her 37 minutes to rewire the circuit. When she flipped the switch, the lights snapped back on with a soft pop, not just in her quadrant, but across the entire bay. Panels blinked awake. Indicators returned to green. And for the briefest moment, it looked like the sub itself exhaled. She stood, hand resting against the bulkhead, eyes scanning the room like she was checking for ghosts. "Still breathing," she whispered. Marks descended from the catwalk with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one without a word. No ceremony. No, you were right. Just mutual recognition, the kind forged in silence and sweat. She took a sip, winced at the bitterness, and smiled anyway. "Terrible coffee," she muttered. "Best we got," he replied. Then they both turned to face the engine. Still dead, but no longer forgotten. The beast had stirred, and beneath Callie's feet, the steel floor no longer felt cold. It felt like memory, like purpose, like something that might just wake up, if someone loved it hard enough. By the end of the week, people started talking. It wasn't loud, not yet. Just whispers in the galley, quiet comments passed between enlisted crew refurbishing the sonar cabin or repainting the hull. "She still at it?" Heard she rewired the fuel relay blind. $10, says she makes that engine purr. The tone had changed. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was something softer curiosity, maybe even admiration wrapped in disbelief. Callie didn't hear any of it. She was too deep inside the beast. Daylight blurred into evening. She'd lost track of meals, of time, of the shifting tides outside the steel shell of the sub. Her fingers moved faster now, every bolt and seal an extension of her thoughts. She rerouted the coolant system completely, using a diagram half burned from age and the margins of a memory her father once left behind on a diner napkin. "Let the engine breathe from the middle," he used to say. "Cool from the heart, not the lungs." She did exactly that, gutted the side pipe, bent new copper lines by hand, and fed coolant through the core like a new circulatory system. She adjusted the pressure valve with a modified torque wrench and welded 2 brackets with borrowed rods and borrowed fire. It wasn't clean work. It was painful, improvisational, beautiful. Somewhere around midnight, the compressor unit backfired. The metal valve exploded outward with a crack like a rifle shot, and a scalding burst of air slammed into her ribs, knocking her sideways onto the steel deck. She grunted hard, teeth clenched. For a moment, she just lay there, breath shallow, stars blurring her vision. The pain in her side was sharp. Something cracked. She didn't check. Instead, she sat up slowly, pressing her palm against the bruised ribs like a dam against the pain, and forced herself to stand. Her knees buckled. She gritted her teeth again, steadied herself on the bulkhead, and exhaled slowly. Then she walked right back to the compressor and fixed the weld. No drama, no complaint, just resolve. When she finally stepped back for air, she found a cup of coffee resting on the side rail, still hot, steam rising off the lid. No note, no name. She knew who it was. For the first time in days, she smiled barely, then took a sip and winced. Still awful. But she drank it anyway. That night, after finishing a series of delicate intake alignments, she sat on the deck with her back to the engine, notebook open, ribs throbbing in sync with her heartbeat. She flipped through old pages, then scribbled something new in the margins. Pain is part of the process. Bruises mean you're close. Then she closed the book, pressed it to her chest, and leaned her head back against the bulkhead. The engine wasn't running yet, but for the first time since she arrived, it felt warm. The crankshaft was the last barrier. Every system Callie had touched was slowly coming back to life. The cooling lines, the intake flow, the air-fuel mix. She'd replaced the injectors, rerouted the ignition leads, even rebuilt the alternator from salvaged parts and patience. But the crankshaft, the soul of the engine, was warped beyond use, and no amount of heat or pressure could reshape it. The part was classified as obsolete, discontinued. No replacements. Not in the depot, not in the Navy archives, not even in the scrapyards where dead ships went to rust in silence. Without it, everything else meant nothing. When Lieutenant Marks found the engine bay empty that afternoon, the coffee cup he'd left still warm and untouched, he blinked in confusion. It was the first time in 9 days she hadn't been there before sunrise. Her notebook was gone. So was the red toolbox. He assumed she'd quit. She hadn't. 70 miles away, down a cracked coastal highway, and behind an abandoned steel shop that hadn't paid rent since 2007, Callie stood in a dark, dust-choked room with a single man, Ellis gun, an old machinist with 2 fingers missing and arms like bridge cables. He hadn't seen her since she was 14, back when she used to sit in the corner of his garage, sketching rotors on scrap cardboard, while her father begged Ellis for machine time. "You sure about this?" he asked, one eyebrow raised. Callie slid the deformed crankshaft onto the bench like an offering. "I need it exact. Same weight, same swing, but one modification: thread the center brace for a secondary timing pin." Ellis gave a low whistle. "That ain't standard." "I know." He stared at her a moment, then nodded. "It'll be done by midnight." Callie sat in the corner like she used to, grease-smudged knees tucked into her chest. The sound of lathes and steel and old radio static filling the space around her like a lullaby. She didn't sleep. She didn't speak. She just watched. By 4 a.m., she was back on the sub. No one saw her return. She moved through the corridors like a shadow, toolbox in one hand, new crankshaft in the other. It was beautiful matte black, precision cut, engraved with one tiny mark near the base. C.R. She installed it with reverence. Every bolt clicked into place, like the closing of a chapter. By dawn, the engine looked almost whole. She sat on the floor, legs stretched out, bruised ribs rising and falling beneath her jumpsuit. In her lap, she held the red toolbox. There, beneath the socket tray, tucked in the very bottom, was the folded paper from her father, the one that said, "You'll know how." And now, she finally did. It wasn't just tools, or notes, or tricks. The secret was her. All of it: the late nights, the bruises, the silence, the stubbornness, the fire. That was what made the dead engine trust her. That was what made her dangerous. The morning fog hung thick along the pier, muting the colors of the world into shades of gray and iron. Inside the submarine, the silence was sharper than usual. Not the usual stillness of sleep, but the tense breath-holding of something about to wake up. Callie stood in front of the engine, face streaked with sweat, hair tied back, hands trembling slightly as she twisted the last bolt into place. Everything was connected now. Every seal tightened, every wire checked twice, every hose bled and primed. The new crankshaft sat nestled inside the heart of the machine, like a transplanted organ, waiting for its first beat. She checked the ignition sequence again, fingers hovering over the old control panel. The key was real brass, pitted, heavy with age. She turned it slowly, listening. Clicks. Pressure buildup. Valve hiss. Then silence. She pressed the starter. The engine coughed once, spat out a stuttering growl, then died. Her breath caught. The silence that followed wasn't just stillness, it was judgment. The engine bay held its breath. From the catwalk above, a few officers exchanged glances. Harrow, arms folded. Marks, unreadable. A petty officer scribbled something into a clipboard, then stopped. Callie didn't move. She stared at the engine, like it had just lied to her. Then she walked over, knelt beside the intake manifold, and placed her hand on the bypass valve. It was the only part she hadn't fully trusted, a piece she'd salvaged from a different sub weeks ago. Rebuilt but never tested under pressure. She twisted the valve half a turn. Just enough. Then she stood, wiped her hands, and tried again. This time, the engine didn't cough. It growled. It roared. It bellowed awake with a sound like thunder trapped inside steel, vibrating through every bolt, every bracket, every square inch of the submarine. The lights overhead flickered from the pulse. Steam hissed from the rear exhaust. The floor beneath her boots vibrated like the heartbeat of something returned from the grave. Officers who had been leaning lazily against the wall now stood at attention. Harrow's face went pale. One of the engineers on the lower deck dropped his wrench in disbelief. Lieutenant Marks didn't blink. Callie just stood there, still, watching, listening. The engine wasn't just running, it was alive. She walked slowly to the control panel, her footsteps quiet against the trembling floor. The readings were clean, RPM stable, pressure optimal. No leaks, no warning lights. She pulled a pen from her jumpsuit and signed her name on the maintenance log. Callie Rhodes, civilian technician. That's all it said. She didn't speak, didn't smile. She just walked back to the toolbox, the red one with her father's initials still scratched into the lid, and closed it gently. Then she placed the brass key back inside and shut the latch with a soft click. Behind her, the engine kept humming steady, proud, and unmistakably hers. The engine had been running for 17 minutes. Callie sat cross-legged on the steel deck, her back against a support beam, watching the pressure gauges like they were vital signs. Everything was holding. Coolant, steady, fuel mix, perfect. Airflow smooth. It shouldn't have worked. Not this fast, not this clean. But somehow, it had, not just because of her hands, but because of every quiet choice made along the way. The long nights, the bruised ribs, the silences she refused to fill with excuses. A low vibration hummed through the floor, like a song remembered after years of forgetting. Lieutenant Marks stood beside the readout panel now, flipping through the logs, trying to find some mechanical sleight of hand. "Everything's balanced," he muttered, half to himself. "It's perfect." Callie didn't answer. She was holding something in her lap, a slip of paper she'd found that morning, wedged in the bottom lining of her father's toolbox. Folded twice, worn smooth. It was a calibration code, handwritten, dated the year before he died. She stared at it now, expression unreadable. It was the final tuning sequence, the one he'd never gotten to test. But she hadn't needed it. Her adjustments were already closer than the code suggested. She'd known. Somehow. Not from reading it, from growing up with it, from watching him build it into her without words. The way he tightened a bolt 1/4 turn past torque. The way he listened to an engine like it had a soul. She hadn't just inherited his tools. She'd inherited his rhythm. She folded the paper again and slipped it into her pocket. Marks approached, nodding toward the engine. "You want to be the one to log the reactivation into the official record?" She shook her head. Already signed the maintenance log. That's not the same. I'm not Navy, she said. This was never about rank. He nodded, understanding something deeper than her words. Then, after a pause, he added quietly, he'd be proud, you know. Callie looked away. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed the storm still quietly swirling beneath. He didn't talk much about pride, just about getting it right. Outside, the sky had started to clear. Sunlight pierced through the rusted slits of the sub's weathered hatches. Dust motes danced in the beams like drifting memories. She stood slowly, stretching her sore limbs, and walked the length of the engine one last time. Ran her hand along the housing, stopping where her father's original repairs had once been marked. She closed her eyes. The engine throbbed beneath her fingertips. Not aggressive, not mechanical, alive. Later that day, a plaque was ordered for the control panel. It would read, USS Belgrave engine reanimated. Restored by Callie Rhodes, civilian technician, in honor of Chief Petty Officer Rhodes. But Callie wouldn't see it until much later. That afternoon, she sat alone in the mess hall, sipping bad coffee, letting the ache in her body speak louder than words. The engine didn't need her anymore, but it would never forget her. The next morning, the hangar doors creaked open just after sunrise. Light poured across the deck like a slow tide, catching the edges of the polished piping and the soft sheen of the now throbbing engine at the heart of the submarine. The restoration was no longer a question. It was a fact. A crowd had gathered near the dock. Quiet at first, mostly base personnel, a few engineers, a retired commander or two. Then the museum director. Then the naval media team. Word had spread faster than anyone expected. A civilian girl, no credentials, no commission, had brought a dead Cold War relic roaring back to life. But the real story wasn't the engine. It was the silence she did it in, the fire she carried behind her eyes, the bruises she didn't explain, the reason none of them could laugh at her anymore. Callie stood just outside the engine room, arms crossed, jumpsuit zipped halfway, hair tied back as always. Her eyes were tired but sharp, scanning the sub's control panel like a final check before a launch. The engine had run all night. Not a single dip in pressure. Lieutenant Harrow approached with a manila envelope. His uniform was perfect. His expression was not. He held it out without speaking. Callie didn't move. What's this? She asked. He cleared his throat. The wager, he said flatly. 10,000, in cash. From me and the rest of the skeptics. She stared at the envelope. Her hands didn't reach for it. Instead, she turned to the engine, walked to the front panel, and pulled a roll of duct tape from her back pocket. With calm precision, she taped the envelope to the side of the engine and scrawled a message over it in thick black marker. Donate to the museum. Put it where kids can see it. Then she stepped back and zipped up her suit. One by one, the officers who had once jeered lined up. Some offered stiff nods, some awkward handshakes. A few mumbled quiet apologies, the kind that don't need words to mean something. Marks was the last to approach. He didn't say anything at first, just looked her over, eyes landing briefly on the dark bruise beneath her collarbone. Hell of a thing you did, he finally said. Callie shrugged. Just a machine, he smiled. No, it wasn't. Then, after a pause, he added, I've got a daughter, 8 years old, wants to be an astronaut. Think maybe one day you could show her a wrench? Callie looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. I'll bring the donuts, she said. That afternoon, she packed up the red toolbox slowly, reverently. Each tool wiped clean, each socket returned to its proper slot. She closed the lid with the same care you'd give a memory. She didn't take the money. She didn't ask for a plaque. She didn't want to be remembered, only understood. The submarine opened to the public 1 month later. Tour groups moved through its narrow corridors, marveling at the control panels, the sonar rooms, the old black and white photos hung neatly along the bulkheads. But when they reached the engine room, the tone shifted. It was quieter there, like people instinctively lowered their voices in the presence of something sacred. The engine still ran, not at full throttle, but enough to pulse, to breathe, to remind the hull it was alive. A soft, rhythmic hum echoed through the deck plating, like the heartbeat of an old memory. On the wall above the ignition switch, a small brass plaque had been installed. Restored by Callie Rhodes, in honor of Chief Petty Officer Rhodes, USN. Sometimes, love sounds like an engine coming back to life. Callie stood in the back of the room that day, tucked behind a support beam, unnoticed in the crowd. She wore jeans, an old hoodie, her hair tied back like always. No jumpsuit, no spotlight. She watched as a girl, maybe 9, maybe 10, stepped away from her family and walked slowly toward the engine. The girl leaned in close, placed a hand on the warm steel, and whispered, "She fixed this?" Her dad nodded. "That's what I heard." Callie smiled and quietly slipped out the side hatch before anyone could ask questions. Back at her own garage, a converted barn behind her rented house near the docks, she unpacked the red toolbox one final time. The tools were worn now, edges smoothed from use, the handles darkened from oil and time. She lined them up on the pegboard wall, but left the lid open. Inside was the folded note from her father, the crankshaft engraving tool, and the calibration code she never needed. In the center of the garage stood a new project, a 1972 Pontiac GTO frame, stripped bare, waiting. It had been dropped off a week earlier by a widowed woman whose husband never finished it. She said, "If you don't take it, it's going to the scrapyard." Callie took it without hesitation. She stepped toward the car now, pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, and opened her notebook to a new page. At the top, she wrote, "Project, Rebuild 2. Then, beneath it, let it breathe from the heart." Outside, the wind stirred through the trees. A seagull cried from the dock. Somewhere in town, the museum was still playing a short video loop about the girl who fixed the engine no one could fix. Her name flashed briefly on screen, followed by a still photo of her standing beside the sub-hair tied back. Eyes clear, hands stained with grease and history. But here, in her garage, none of that mattered. What mattered was the engine in front of her, the tools in her hands, the memory behind her, the fire still burning steady in her chest, and the road ahead hers to carve, one bolt at a time.